A city is a place to live, work, or study, but it's also a built environment with enough charm. We might even say it's a landscape or a whole gallery of prize collections. One example in Boston is a piece of commercial history that towers over Kenmore Square. Thanks to an agreement brokered by City Hall, the Citgo sign will stay in place for years to come. To give us some perspective on why that should matter is the director of the Preservation Studies program in the American and New England Studies program at Boston University, Professor Daniel Bluestone. Thank you very much for being with us, Professor.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Start with the history of this. I mean, go back to that moment when this sign fit the logic of a particular point in time. And so how did it get there?
Yeah, there's a long history of outdoor advertising, and interestingly, there have been reform movements that attempted to rid the landscape of outdoor advertising. The Citgo sign is an iconic sign in the history of Boston. It's the most recognizable sign. That was a combination of both good design that had simplicity and also resonated deeply with the public, and it also helps mark Kenmore Square as people approach the city along highways and byways, but it's also become a sign that resonates deeply with people who are engaged in the collective rituals of Boston. Marathon runners approaching the finish line, when they come toward Kenmore Square and they see that sign, they know they can make it to the end of the marathon. People sitting and watching World Series games or baseball games in Fenway Park, seeing the Citgo sign loom over the cityscape, over the skyline out of Fenway Park, incredibly important for situating them in place. Chris, when I joined Boston University's faculty 3 years ago, I was housed as part of the interview process at the Commonwealth Hotel. I grew up in Boston. I was born within a mile of Fenway Park, and when I looked out of the hotel room and saw the Citgo sign, I felt I was home. And I think that there are lots of people who, since 1965, that sign is something that marks their connection to Boston, to the broader city. We have the State House on Beacon Hill. We have Paul Revere's house in the North End. The Citgo sign has become every bit as much of a real landmark that convinces people and lets them feel situated in place. So I'm very pleased that the mayor stepped in and went through the process of bringing together these two parties, Citgo and Related Beal, that owns the building, to ensure that the sign will be part of our familiar landscape. You have to understand, Boston is changing tremendously. The skyline is changing. And for people, many people are encouraged and happy to see the growth, the redevelopment of our city. But it's also important for those people in those neighborhoods and neighbors around Kenmore Square to see familiar landmarks that help situate them in the overall culture and physical environment of the city. The Citgo sign does that very, very well.
How do you explain the alchemy here? Because this started out as a functional novelty, a sign of modern times, maybe. But now Citgo doesn't have that many gas stations anymore, and it's sort of outlived or maybe transcended the function. Yeah. What does that mean?
Well, it's interesting. I'm a bicyclist, and I don't buy Citgo gas to get around commuting in Boston. I use mass transit and a bicycle. But the sign is still an incredibly important landmark. And as I say, you can just go out into the city and look at the multiple points where, as you approach Boston, downtown Boston, you see the Citgo sign. And it's just something that helps people feel situated in the broader landscape. It's an incredibly important landmark for that reason. And it's almost not relevant. I understand that Citgo wasn't anxious to pay a huge amount of money because they don't have enough local business to maybe support the sign. But they understood that this is an important sign for Boston, and it also, I think, a national symbol of their company. So I think for them it does pay certain publicity ends. And for the citizens of Boston, as I say, incredibly important for helping people feel comfortable in place.
This is BNN News. We're talking with Boston University professor Daniel Bluestone. What about the future here? I mean, there is this agreement between the property owners and the company that owns the sign itself, but I'm sure there are a lot more complexities ahead.
Sure. One of the most important things, and one of the things that preservationists are continuing to strive for with the Citgo sign, is to have it officially recognized as a Boston landmark. Now, a number of years ago, there was an effort to actually list the Citgo sign as a Boston landmark. And one of the things that happened is that I think the Landmarks Commission read the ordinance way too narrowly. They said, well, it has LED lights now instead of the fluorescent tubes. I think that's crazy. Most people in Boston don't care whether it's LEDs or fluorescent tubes. What they care about is this familiar form that hovers in the skyline prominently and again makes them feel comfortable in the city that they love, in the place where they live, and even for visitors from out of town. So we're hoping as we move ahead that we'll be able to establish this as an official Boston landmark, which it clearly is. It's a landmark in every sense of the word. And what that will do is it will let the professionals at the Landmarks Commission and the public to have a venue to weigh in on the future of the sign. That is, as that block is undoubtedly headed for redevelopment, it will let the preservationist community and citizens in Boston be able to participate in discussions about the final disposition or the next disposition of this sign as part of the skyline. If you had a 60-story building go up on that, I think many people would say, no, we don't want the Citgo sign on the roof. We want to figure out how to have the Citgo sign have the same human relationship that it has to the city now. Maybe that has us having to clip the sign onto the side of a new building rather than to put it on its roof. So very important is the continuing stewardship of that. Establishing this as a Boston landmark will go a long way to having the right voices at the table when those discussions are had.
There's another thing about this sign is that the way it resonates in memory for people, because I mean, I've been in Boston so long. I remember the dirty old Boston days, the rat in Kenmore Square. So when I see that sign, I'm not just looking at the square, I'm thinking back as well.
Right. Well, so if it reminds you of the rats, I remember Kenmore Square and the Citgo sign at the same time. As your eyes were drawn heavenward, you didn't notice the rats. You didn't notice the
rat scholars for that matter.
Right. So that's the thing is that this was, I think, always with its precise lines and its beautiful triangulated form. There was actually an artfulness that sign contributed to the landscape that had become increasingly blighted over the years. And I think that the sign now is totally in concert with the redevelopment that's happened. It fits very well, despite it being over 50 years old at this point. It helps people, again, know where Kenmore Square is, and it now accrues all the attractive associations that we want our landmarks to accrue. And I think that sign has presided over the fall and then the renaissance of Kenmore Square.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Professor Daniel Bluestone.